BDS a choisi de s'appuyer sur le droit international comme moyen de résistance non violent, et dans ce cadre-là, on utilise la définition de l'apartheid telle qu'elle a été votée par l'ONU en 1973. L'article 1 de cette définition qualifie l'apartheid de crime contre l'humanité, et ensuite la définition poursuit en expliquant que la situation de l'apartheid s'applique à toute situation, quel que soit le pays, si les trois éléments suivants coexistent. 1. Là où deux groupes raciaux différents peuvent être identifiés avec un groupe subordonné à l'autre. À noter que tout groupe identifiable constitue un groupe racial en droit international. 2. Là où des actes inhumains sont commis contre le groupe subordonné. Et 3. Là où ces actes sont commis systématiquement dans le cadre d'un régime institutionnalisé de domination d'un groupe sur l'autre. Donc on voit que c'est vraiment le caractère systématique qui permet de faire la distinction entre la pratique de l'apartheid et d'autres formes de discrimination raciale. En pratique, l'État d'Israël distingue deux groupes, puisqu'il y a des citoyens juifs, qui sont à la fois citoyens et nationaux, et les Arabes israéliens, qui sont citoyens d'Israël, mais exclus de la nationalité, et donc des bénéfices qui en découlent. De nombreuses lois et dispositions racistes sont promulguées par le gouvernement israélien, et celles-ci discriminent de manière institutionnelle aussi bien les Palestiniens d'Israël que ceux de la diaspora, que ceux des territoires palestiniens occupés. Et malgré cela, Israël continue de se présenter comme le seul pays démocratique de la région. Et cette vision est véhiculée par de nombreux pays, dont la Suisse et de nombreux médias mainstream. En fait, Israël a pu cacher pendant de nombreuses années ses agissements répressifs et discriminatoires en s'appuyant sur l'argument sécuritaire pour maintenir la survie d'un pays et d'un peuple. Sa politique de colonisation et d'apartheid est illégale du point de vue international, et malgré cela, Israël a pu jusqu'à présent échapper en grande partie aux discussions politiques et éviter des sanctions. Mais il est quand même étonnant que la soi-disant nature juive et démocratique de l'État d'Israël ne pose aucun problème, alors que l'on devrait se demander comment un État théocratique qui discrimine 1/5 de sa population peut être démocratique. On nous pose souvent la question pourquoi BDS se focalise sur la question de l'apartheid, parce qu'il y a celles et ceux pour qui l'apartheid se réfère uniquement à la situation en Afrique du Sud, et d'autres, même dans les milieux pro-palestiniens, qui ne voient pas l'intérêt de s'appuyer sur le droit international parce qu'il a plus souvent tranché en faveur des pays puissants. Mais la Convention sur l'apartheid fait de celui-ci un crime international, et cela entraîne des conséquences majeures au niveau du droit international parce que les États sont obligés d'adopter des mesures législatives pour supprimer, décourager et punir le crime de l'apartheid. Ainsi, tous les États ont le devoir de ne pas reconnaître comme licite la situation qui découle du régime d'apartheid établi en Israël et dans les territoires palestiniens occupés. Tous les États ont l'obligation de ne prêter ni aide ni assistance au maintien de la situation créée par un tel régime. Et dans le cas où des États n'obligeraient pas Israël à respecter le droit international, ils pourraient être considérés comme complices des violations commises par Israël et leur responsabilité pourrait être engagée. Et les entreprises aussi ont une responsabilité de ne pas tirer profit d'une situation illégale. Ainsi, en dévoilant le caractère raciste institutionnalisé et systématique de la politique israélienne, le droit international nous fournit, à nous, membres de la société civile, un levier précieux pour agir auprès de nos gouvernements, des Nations Unies, des institutions internationales, des entreprises, des fonds de pension, pour exiger le boycott, les désinvestissements et les sanctions contre l'État d'Israël, jusqu'à ce que ce dernier se soumette au droit international et reconnaisse les droits légitimes des Palestiniens et des Palestiniennes, qui sont le droit à la liberté, à l'égalité et à la justice.
Allow me to begin by telling you what some of my country people, fellow South Africans, have said about that great democracy called Israel. South Africa's former president, Kgalema Motlanthe, said, "The current situation for Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory is worse than conditions were for blacks under the apartheid regime." The president of the Congress of South African Trade Unions in South Africa said of Zionism that it is a version of apartheid based on the doctrine that Jews are superior to Arabs and therefore have a right to oppress them and occupy their country. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who of course you all know, said, "I've been very deeply distressed in my visit to the Holy Land. It reminded me so much of what happened to us black people in South Africa. I have seen the humiliation of the Palestinians at checkpoints and roadblocks, suffering like us when young white police officers prevented us from moving about." A former president of COSATU, the Congress of South African Trade Unions, Willie Madisha, said, "As someone who lived in apartheid South Africa and who has visited Palestine, I say with confidence that Israel is an apartheid state. In fact, I believe that some of Israel's actions make the actions of South Africa's apartheid regime appear pale by comparison. The horrendous dehumanization of black South Africans during the erstwhile apartheid years is a Sunday picnic compared with what I saw and what I know is happening to the Palestinian people. Another South African, in this case a white and Jewish South African, a treason trialist who was tried by the apartheid regime for treason, and who was released by the apartheid state into exile in 1985 and decided to go into exile to Israel, said that after arriving in Israel, he saw, quote, many similarities in the oppression of blacks in South Africa and of Palestinians. He called for a total economic boycott of Israel, singling out Israel as a major ally of the South African apartheid regime. And then he left Israel to live in Britain because he could not tolerate Israel's oppressive policies towards Palestinians. He, as I said, was Jewish. I can, of course, quote numerous other South African leaders and activists of the liberation movement that essentially say the same thing, but I think that these make the point adequately. What it suggests to us is that the notion of a Jewish and democratic Israeli state is really a farce, a fictitious creation that is used to mask what is really an ethnocratic, racist, oppressive state that practices occupation, colonialism, and apartheid in violation of international law. But let me take a step back and ask, why is it that so many South Africans so easily use the apartheid label for Israel? Why do people who have suffered under apartheid refer to Israel as an apartheid state? First, let me suggest that we agree on what apartheid means. Now, I don't understand French, so I don't know what our chairperson said. So I'm hoping that what I'm going to tell you now does not contradict what she said. As I understand apartheid, it is a systematic, institutionalized way in which people are discriminated against on the basis of their so-called race or on the basis of their ethnicity, and where rights and privileges flow to people on the basis of their so-called race or ethnicity. In South Africa, that meant that whites were privileged over blacks. In Israel and for Palestinians, it means that Jews are privileged over non-Jews. In South Africa, apartheid was constructed on three pillars, consisting of a plethora of legislation and machinery that was set up to make that legislation real. The first of these pillars was the formal demarcation of the population, South African population, into so-called racial groups through what was called the Population Registration Act, a piece of legislation that was passed in 1950. The year 1950 is interesting because it's also coincidental, you'll see when I talk about Israel. After the passing of the Population Registration Act, superior rights, privileges, and services were then accorded to whites through various other pieces of legislation. For example, the Bantu Building Workers Act, the Bantu Education Act, and the Separate Amenities Act. The second pillar of apartheid then segregated the population into different geographical areas and restricted the movement of people between these areas. This pillar relied on a number of other pieces of legislation, such as the Group Areas Act, in terms of which residential areas were for the exclusive, and business commercial areas were for the exclusive use of particular racial groups. The pass laws, which restricted the freedom of movement of particularly African people, and various other pieces of legislation. This separation was the basis for what we call, and what the architects of apartheid called, Grand Apartheid, which established homelands or Bantustans into which denationalized black South Africans were transferred and forced to reside, allowing the white minority to deny them political rights in and preserve white supremacy over the majority of South Africa's territory. Now, let me just say that when we talk about grand apartheid, this is really what the objective of apartheid was. So many people around the world know apartheid through things like the fact that you had toilets that were for the exclusive use of whites, for example, or park benches, etc. This is what we refer to as petty apartheid. It's the small, in a sense, silly kind of manifestations of apartheid. This wasn't the real objective of what apartheid aimed to achieve. What it aimed to achieve is what we call grand apartheid. The separation of people into different population groups, and then the African population, which made up around 85% of the population, their citizenship in South Africa was removed. They were denationalized, and their citizenship was then allocated to these fictitious Bantustans, or as the government called them, independent homelands. So they were no longer regarded as citizens of South Africa. They therefore had no rights within South Africa. There's a bit of a similarity with Palestinians, and one big difference. Palestinians also, certainly 700,000 of them that were forced into becoming refugees, were deprived of any citizenship in the land where they lived, which later became the State of Israel. The difference being that they were not given any new citizenship or any new nationality. All of this that I've spoken about in South Africa was then buttressed and supported by a third very important pillar, a very repressive security matrix which consisted of laws, policies, and repressive machinery that were all used to suppress opposition and to reinforce racial domination. The repressive instruments included administrative detention, torture, censorship, banning, and even extrajudicial assassination. Now, Israeli apartheid, both within the State of Israel itself and the occupied Palestinian territory, and I want to emphasize this, that when I talk about Israeli apartheid, or Israel being an apartheid state, I'm not simply talking about its behavior and its practices and its policies in the occupied territories. I'm talking about Israel's behavior as well within the State of Israel towards its non-Jewish, particularly Palestinian citizens. So Israeli apartheid, both within the State of Israel and in the occupied Palestinian territory, the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, is also based on the same three pillars of apartheid. The first pillar in Israel demarcates people into different groups, Jews and non-Jews. This is done through the 1950, as I said, remember the date, through the 1950 Law of Return, which defines who is a Jew and grants Jews all over the world the right to immigrate to Israel, or actually also to immigrate after 1967 to the occupied Palestinian territory, to the West Bank and Gaza. Then the 1952 citizenship law granted automatic citizenship to Jews who immigrate in this way, while making it virtually impossible for others, particularly Palestinian refugees, to gain citizenship. This despite the fact that most of these Jewish immigrants would have absolutely no relationship of lineage to the land of Palestine whatsoever, while the families of Palestinian refugees might have lived on that land for thousands of years. Another law which helped to define a citizen, or rather to deprive a large number of Palestinians of their citizenship in the new Israeli state, was the 1948 absentee property law. This law divided Palestinians who had lived in what later became Israel, what became Israel, into three categories: those who were present, those who were absent, and those who, to us rational people, might sound ridiculous, those who were present absentees. This ensured that all Palestinian refugees from a period in 1947 to 1948, just after the establishment of the State of Israel, including those who were internally displaced within Israel, could not have citizenship rights. Now, let me explain these three categories. I think it's necessary for us to understand what they mean. So, in terms of the absentee property law, those who were present were Palestinians who were, of course, whose families lived in what became Israel in 1948, who had lived there for generations or centuries or even millennia, and who in that period between 1947 and 48, which was a period of the greatest amount of activity by the various Jewish gangs, the Irgun, the Stern, etc., and whose activities resulted in 700,000 Palestinians becoming refugees, intimidated, murdered, forced off their land and out of their homes. Those Palestinians who in that period resisted that intimidation and remained in their homes were regarded as present. They, unfortunately, according to the Israeli state, continued to live where they were living, continued to reside in their homes, and so they were present, and they were then grudgingly given some citizenship rights. Not the same rights as Jewish citizens, but nevertheless they were regarded as citizens. They were present. Those who were absent were those Palestinians who in that period fled their homes, became refugees, expected that refugee status will last a few weeks or a few months before they return home, and became refugees and lived in either Gaza or the West Bank or Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, or various other parts of the world. And there's quite a few of those people in Switzerland. One or two might be in this room. They were absent. Okay, so they were regarded in terms of this law as absent. They had absolutely no rights in the state of Israel. They had no claims on their homes or their lands. They had no claims on citizenship. They just were disappeared from a legal perspective. The third category, of course, which is the most curious category, the present absentees, were those who were forced out of their homes or off their lands, didn't go to Gaza or the West Bank or Jordan, Syria or Lebanon, but moved somewhere else within what became the state of Israel, and so they were internally displaced. So they were not present in their homes in this period. They were absent from their homes, but they were present within what became the state of Israel. So a very inconvenient group of people, because they were present and absent at the same time as far as the Israeli state were concerned, and so they were present absentees. They don't have the same kind of citizenship rights as those who are present have. They have very little citizenship rights. Many of them have ended up in what are now called in Israel unrecognized villages, in residential areas that are not recognized by the state as residential areas, and therefore are not given any services. Their homes are often repeatedly destroyed, and they have no claims on anything. But they actually live in Israel. They've never become refugees outside. They live in the state of Israel. The result of these few pieces of legislation is an institutionalized system that privileges Jewish citizens of Israel over non-Jewish citizens, and privileges Jewish settlers in the occupied Palestinian territory, living of course in settlements, all of which are illegal under international law, privileges them over Palestinian residents of the occupied Palestinian territory. And I don't say Palestinian citizens because they actually don't have any citizenship really, Palestinians in the occupied territory. In Israel, within the state of Israel, the discrimination includes a denial of full welfare benefits for Palestinian citizens, restrictions on what might be taught and learnt in schools, restriction on certain types of jobs being held by Palestinians, and various other restrictions and discriminations. Then in 2003, the Citizenship and Entry into Israel law, which banned Palestinian family unification, is another example of discriminatory legislation. In the occupied Palestinian territory, I might just say also that another big result of the absentee property law, which I spoke about, was the manner in which Palestinian land was stolen from Palestinians. Not only those who became refugees, but also those who remained in Israel, also those who were present. In the occupied Palestinian territory, Palestinians are denied the right to leave and return to their country. freedom of movement and residence, and access to land. This also applies to Palestinians of East Jerusalem, who have a separate status. So within what was Mandate Palestine, you in a sense have Palestinians with at least 4 different statuses. One is Palestinians who live in Gaza, who have a different status. Then you have Palestinians who live in the West Bank, who have a different status. Palestinians who live in Jerusalem, a third status. And then Palestinians who live in Israel. And of course, even that last category, as I said, there are those who have citizenship rights and those who don't within Israel. The disparity in the treatment of the two groups, Jews and non-Jews, is highlighted through the application of harsher laws and different courts for Palestinians in the occupied territories than for Jewish settlers in the occupied territories, and through restrictions imposed by the permit and ID systems. The discrimination is also illustrated by the access to water in the occupied territories for Palestinians and Jewish settlers, with settlers being allocated the bulk of West Bank water at a fraction of the price that Palestinians are forced to pay. The second pillar of apartheid in Israel is bolstered by the absentee property law, which I've mentioned already, which ensured land theft on a grand scale, including for Palestinians who remained in what became Israel. It is also based on other laws regarding land ownership and land use. It's noteworthy that by 1947, which is not only before the State of Israel was created, but also before the United Nations passed Resolution 181, that by 1947, Jews made up 30% of the population of Palestine, of Mandate Palestine, and owned 7% of the land. Okay, so they were 30% of the population, they owned 7% of the land. And despite this fact, the United Nations, in its ultimate great wisdom, decided to partition Palestine into what it called a Jewish state on 55% of the land, and an Arab state on 45% of the land. Of course, by the end of 1948, the newly created Israeli state was occupying 78% of the land of Palestine, leaving only 22%, which it then occupied in 1967. Today, land in Israel, and that is within the state of Israel itself, not in the occupied territories, land in Israel is divided into 2 broad categories. The first category is national lands, which is 93% of the land, and the second category is private lands, which is 7% of the land. National land is further broken up into 2 categories: state lands, which is owned by the State of Israel, and JNF, or Jewish National Fund lands, which is owned by the Jewish National Fund, which supposedly is a non-governmental organization. And the Jewish National Fund owns the bulk of national lands, and all Jewish National Fund lands are for the exclusive use of Jews. I think it's a great travesty of justice that in many Western countries, the JNF has local branches and is granted status as an NGO, when in fact it is an arm of an oppressive apartheid state. Palestinians in the state of Israel may own land only in the private land category. So 20% of the population of Israel may only use land in 7% of the land that exists, and in that too they compete for access with Jews, of course. And while Israel does not have a law similar to the South African Group Areas Act, in South Africa the Group Areas Act defined if you are of a particular racial group, then you could only live in this area or that area. While in Israel there isn't an equivalent of the Group Areas Act, a number of Israeli court judgments and a recent law have had the same effect by preventing Palestinian families living in Jewish areas. Another form of separation in South Africa was the Mixed Marriages Act, which some of you might know about. So in terms of the Mixed Marriages Act in South Africa, people were not allowed to marry across the so-called racial boundaries. So people of different color groups were not allowed to marry each other. We also had, incidentally, the Immorality Act, in terms of which people from different racial groups were not allowed to have sex with each other, irrespective of whether they were married or not. Israel does not have the equivalent of the Mixed Marriages Act, whereby people can't marry across the color line. However, in Israel, there is no such thing as civil marriage. All marriages, or the only marriages in Israel, are religious marriages. And therefore, in Israel, Jews are not allowed to marry non-Jews. So the effect is the same. The second pillar of apartheid, as it operates in the occupied Palestinian territory, is reflected by Israel's having fragmented the occupied territories for the purposes of segregation and domination. Separated Gaza from the West Bank, and within the West Bank separated the broader West Bank from Jerusalem, and within the rest of the West Bank separated parts from each other. This includes Israel's extensive theft of Palestinian land in various ways in the West Bank, including through the apartheid wall, thus shrinking the space available to Palestinians and forcing them into specific geographic fragments. Also, the hermetic closure and isolation of Gaza, and the severing of East Jerusalem from the rest of the West Bank. Appropriation and construction policies, which have created a settlement infrastructure that has carved up the West Bank into a network of connected settlements for Jewish Israelis and besieged non-contiguous Palestinian enclaves. Now, when I talk about the settlement infrastructure in the West Bank, I'm careful to talk about the settlement infrastructure and not just settlements, because the settlement project in the West Bank is much more than settlements. The settlements are bad enough with 500,000 illegal settlers there, but they're connected via a whole series of roads and highways and whole range of infrastructure, which when you look at the map, actually cuts up the West Bank into different parts and forces Palestinians to live separately from each other because they're separated by this infrastructure. So this infrastructure has carved up the West Bank into a network of connected settlements for Jewish Israelis, as I said. The segregation along racial lines and Palestinians from each other is obvious from the walls, separate roads, checkpoints, and the web of permit and ID systems, which ensure that Palestinians remain confined to their Bantustans, while Israeli Jews are prohibited from entering those Bantustans but enjoy freedom of movement throughout the rest of Palestinian territory. As an aside, I should just say that in South Africa, I think I'd be correct in saying that we black people actually never even dreamt that we would have a situation where there would be roads in our country that would be for the exclusive use of white people, and black people would be prevented from driving on or walking on those roads. We didn't even dream that such a thing could happen. In the West Bank, that's a reality. You have roads and highways that are for the exclusive use of Jews, and Palestinians are not allowed on them. As with Bantustans in South Africa, Bantustans in Palestine result in crushing Palestinian economic life, making Palestinians vulnerable to Israeli economic dominance, and enforcing rigid segregation. The third pillar of apartheid, which Israel's system in the occupied Palestinian territories rests, is its repressive security laws and machinery. And these actually bear very little resemblance to South Africa. Sure, the extrajudicial assassinations, including on foreign territory, by the way, a couple of years ago in Dubai, for example, and before that in Europe, extrajudicial assassinations of Palestinians. So sure, such extrajudicial assassinations, torture, administrative detention, etc., are similar to what we faced in South Africa. These policies are state-sanctioned, often approved by the Israeli judiciary, and supported by oppressive military laws and military courts. This security is effectively used to justify restrictions on Palestinian freedom of expression, freedom of opinion, assembly, association, and movement, and to suppress all dissent and to control Palestinians. However, the deployment of Israel's repressive machinery in the occupied territories is really quite unfamiliar to South Africans. And I say that because in South Africa we never had, even in the worst days of apartheid, instances where tanks, helicopter gunships and fighter jets were deployed to enter or fly over our residential areas, to bomb our homes and to fire shells and missiles into our schools. At the worst times of apartheid in South Africa, we never had a single tank entering our townships, let alone helicopters and fighter jets. Now, apart from drawing parallels between Israeli apartheid and South African apartheid, which is a useful exercise, certainly for us South Africans it's a useful exercise, and at least for some Palestinians, I think it's also important for us to look at another aspect of what we mean when we talk about apartheid and what we mean when we talk about Israel as an apartheid state. Because apartheid, apart from being something that was done in South Africa or by South Africans, apartheid is also regarded as a crime against humanity, and for which there actually exists an international instrument, an international legal instrument. Indeed, the International Convention for the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid, which entered into force in 1976, actually doesn't even mention South Africa even once. So the convention talks about apartheid as if it is something that can be applied by any state anywhere in the world. And there's nothing special about it and South Africa. And I think that's a very useful way in which to talk about apartheid as an international, or as a crime that can be committed by any state. The convention details what apartheid practices are and prescribes punishment for states which practice it. Almost every clause of Article 2 of the convention, which describes various apartheid practices, almost every clause of this article applies to Israel's actions either within the Israeli state or within the occupied Palestinian territory. And so in terms of the convention, Israel is an apartheid state. Having spoken about the parallels between the two apartheid states, South Africa and Israel, I think it would be unfair if we just stopped there in terms of parallels, and certainly for us as South Africans, we feel that it would be unfair if we stopped just by describing the oppressive machineries of the two and comparing the two. I think that it's also important that we talk about what parallels might exist or what lessons might be learnt by discussing the South African and Palestinian struggles as well. Because if we sell ourselves short if we just talk about what the oppressors do and not talk about how people resist. Now, in South Africa, when we analyze the South African struggle against apartheid, we talk about it being built on four pillars of struggle, as we say. The first one of these, and I know I keep talking about pillars, 3 pillars of apartheid, 4 pillars of struggle, but you'll forgive me, I'm sure. The first of these 4 pillars of struggle is mass mobilization, or what we now like to refer to as the South African Intifada. Mass mobilization, internal resistance within the country. And that included the building of a whole range of civil society organizations and all kinds of things, some pretty and some ugly. And we can talk about the ugly bits later if you want. The second pillar was the underground movement within the country, and so that was the liberation movement that was exiled, smuggling people into the country, committing acts of sabotage, blowing up a police station here, electricity pylon there, setting up communications networks, etc. So the underground movement. The third pillar was the armed struggle. So all of the various parts of the liberation movement, whether you're talking about the African National Congress or the Pan-Africanist Congress or the Black Consciousness Movement, or each of them had their own armies, their own armed wings, which prepared themselves for war against the apartheid state's army, which war never came, but it was there. So there was the armed struggle, which was the third pillar. And the fourth pillar was the international solidarity and the international isolation of the apartheid state. So these were the 4 pillars on which the struggle against apartheid in South Africa was based. There's a general kind of consensus among activists and academics in South Africa that that two of these pillars were largely symbolic. The underground movement and its activities, particularly in terms of sabotage operations, etc., and the armed struggle played largely a symbolic role. So yes, a police station was bombed. Generally, no police were even killed in there. But a police station was bombed and made those of us who were in the country feel good. That our army is active. We're doing things. We can confront the state, etc. So it had symbolic value, not real value. It didn't bring down the state, but it kept alive the spirit of resistance. So the armed struggle and the underground movement had that kind of symbolic value. And of course, we also learned the dances and marches of the soldiers who were outside the country, and we used them within the country, and that also made us feel good. But there's general acceptance that the two pillars that actually made a difference and that helped to bring about the end of the apartheid state and helped to bring apartheid to its knees was the internal resistance and the international isolation of the apartheid state. For the Palestinian context then, we South African activists believe that it is also these two, the internal resistance of Palestinians themselves and the international solidarity and the international isolation of the Israeli apartheid state that are most relevant. And so as solidarity activists, we believe that we should support the continued internal resistance of the Palestinian people in whatever forms Palestinian people choose to resist. Beyond support for the resistance, our greatest task is to join together around the world to ensure the isolation of the apartheid Israeli state, in order to put sufficient pressure on that state that it finds itself having to admit that things must be done differently, that Palestinian demands are legitimate and must be addressed. And so, in line with this kind of thinking, on the 9th of July 2005, close to 150 Palestinian organizations issued a historic declaration and call, a document which has become more significant over the past 10 years than it was when it was issued, in fact. That document was the Palestinian United Call for BDS against Israel, boycotts, divestment and sanctions. 4 days after it was issued, so on the 13th of July 2005, the United Nations International Civil Society Conference in support of Middle East peace in Paris issued a declaration which said, and I quote, "We recognize that our strength lies in our ability to work collectively in unified campaigns and actions. We urge international, national, and regional social movements, organizations, and coalitions to support the unified call of Palestinian civil society for a global campaign of boycotts, divestment, and sanctions, to pressure Israel to end the occupation and fully comply with international law and all relevant United Nations resolutions." So this was, as I said, 4 days after the call was issued. It seemed as if civil society across the world had really been waiting for Palestinians unequivocally to call on them in this manner. I don't think the drafters of the call realized what a quick and effective response there would be to their appeal within 4 days, in fact, or in the past 10 years, if we think of us now. So almost 10 years after the call was made, BDS has become a term that now has global resonance, a term that is used almost in equal measure by Palestinian supporters and by their Zionist detractors, and is being recognized by Zionists as a danger to their racist project in Palestine. BDS, they say, is delegitimization of the state of Israel, which frankly is correct. And Israel and Zionism should be delegitimized. It is because BDS is effective that there is such a hysterical campaign around the world against it by the Israeli state and by Israeli apologists. BDS, they tell us, is the new anti-Semitism. BDS is slanderous. BDS is anti-Jewish, etc., etc. And BDS is taken so seriously by Israel that it will even use its repressive machinery to silence some of the most prominent BDS activists, as the recent anti-boycott law suggests. What has BDS achieved around the world? Quite a lot. There's a growing international fervor and fever around BDS, around supporting an effective, non-violent response to Israel's militarist, brutal, criminal acts of violence against the Palestinian people. I can go through some of I have a whole list, like pages, of successes of the BDS movement just in 2014 that I'm not going to go through right now. I think if anyone's interested, you can look at the BNC's website, bdsmovement.net, to see what those successes have been. So I'm not going to go through that, and let me rather come to an end in my presentation so we can have some time for some discussion. The boycott, divestment and sanctions campaign is no longer now just a good idea for us to try out or something for us to experiment with. It is rather a global campaign and a global movement that will help sound the death knell for Israel's apartheid project and will help liberate both Palestinians and Israelis. And I'm serious when I say both Palestinians and Israelis. When we spoke about the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, we were clear as black people that our struggle was not to liberate black people, that our struggle was to liberate black people, black South Africans, and to liberate white South Africans from their own oppressive policies. And the struggle of Palestinians is to liberate Palestinians and to liberate Jewish Israelis from their own idiocies and stupid policies. Just as the global anti-apartheid movement and its campaign to isolate the apartheid South African state was the non-violent weapon that ultimately helped to bring apartheid in South Africa to its knees, so too will the BDS campaign help bring apartheid in Israel to its knees. As a South African who lived and suffered under and fought against apartheid and racist capitalism in my country, and being committed to struggling against apartheid wherever it might exist, I'm convinced that that is us activists all around the world, that our joining together in this movement will prove us to be on the right side of history and on the right side of morality. Because supporting racism is immoral, excusing racism is immoral, and tolerating racism is immoral. We have only one choice: to stand on the side of justice and the suffering and oppressed people of Palestine and the world, or forever to live with the knowledge that we deliberately passed up a unique opportunity presented to us by the BDS movement. To do the right thing, to stand side by side with oppressed people in their struggle for justice, and to be part of history. Thank you.